When I was a kid, both of my parents had to constantly work overtime at dead-end jobs just to keep the lights on and food on the table. This meant not only did we have to live very frugally, but I also didn't get to spend time with them nearly as often as a kid should. It wasn't all bad. At the very least, I knew my mom and dad cared about me and would do anything to make my life a little easier, even if they were barely ever around to show it. We were also lucky enough to live in a neighborhood that, while relatively poor, was full of neighbors who looked out for each other. But our biggest saving grace was my uncle, Chris. He was, to put it lightly, loaded. Though I never found out the specifics of what he did for a living, I did know he had some sort of position at NASA. Even with his busy lifestyle, he still found time to visit us at least once a month, to help us pay the bills, and sometimes to bring a little something special for me. Despite Chris's frequent visits to our house, however, I have to admit he never really felt like he was part of our family. Sure, he was nice and all, but every time I looked at him, he had an unreadable look on his face, like his mind was somewhere far away from our shabby home. He never felt like he belonged, even at larger family get-togethers when all manner of wacky characters showed up at our house. This wasn't helped by the presents he gave me. They were always from his work, always given to me with little to no explanation, and always weird. One time during the holidays, he handed me a glowing rock. Yep, a straight-up glowing rock. Without saying what it was or why it was glowing. It stopped glowing after a week and just became a normal rock, but still. Another time on my birthday, he gave me a handful of what he called special eggs, and told me to put them in water. I assumed at the time they'd hatch into sea monkeys or something of that like, but instead they turned the water black and made the house smell like sulfur, leading me to hurriedly dump the whole thing into a storm drain. As I got older, the frequency of Chris visits, and of the presents, gradually began to decrease. My parents regularly expressed their sympathies, as they themselves couldn't afford much for me on special occasions, but I think secretly they were glad not to have to put up with whatever Chris decided to bring into our house next. Nevertheless, Chris continued to support us financially, and as selfish as it sounds, I think we were content to accept his money without having to actually interact with him. Then one day, when I was on winter break and around 15 years old, he showed up unannounced. It had been snowing all evening, and my mother had finished preparing a meager meal of chicken soup on the gas stove. We were just sitting down to eat when the knock on the door came and he was standing there, tall and broad-shouldered and covered in white powder, looking like an oversized snowman. Mom expressed her surprise and excitement he was still her brother, after all, and pulled him into a hug in the doorway. He simply patted her on the back, his eyes as far away as always. After sitting down with us, Chris explained that he had been working very hard at his department at NASA for the past few years, but had recently accomplished something very big, allowing him to take some time off to rest. Of course, he wouldn't say what he had accomplished. He'd always been secretive about his job like that. But we didn't want to get him in trouble for revealing classified info or anything like that, so we never pressed for details. "Oh, Eli," he said suddenly, turning to me. This startled me enough to spill a bit of soup onto my lap, lightly singeing my legs through my pants. Chris rarely called me by my name, and almost never expressed any actual interest in talking to me as he did now. "Why, yeah? What is it, Uncle Chris?" I answered, trying my best to sound polite. "I brought a little something for you from work. After dinner, how about you come help me try it out?" I saw my parents exchange tired, knowing looks, not only at the return of Chris's infamous presents, but at the fact that this one was one that apparently needed to be tried out. Still, he'd been paying our bills for all these years. The least we could do was let him stay with us for a bit, and to entertain whatever it was he had planned for me. Chris got up from the table early, telling me to stay put and walking out the front door. From the window, I saw him rummaging around the trunk of his car, before lifting out a sizable cardboard box, and disappearing from view as he carried it around the back of our house. A few minutes later, I heard the back door open and Chris's voice calling for me to come outside. I looked at my mom, who simply nodded, as if to say go out there and humor the guy. After putting on my ratty coat and water-damaged boots, I stepped out into the snow-covered yard, mentally preparing myself to see whatever knick-knack he'd stolen from Area 51. It had stopped snowing at that point, and as my eyes adjusted to the dying light, I was surprised to see that it was just a telescope. No fancy levers or boggles attached, it looked about as ordinary as telescopes come. He smiled when he saw me, or at least attempted to do what he thought a smile looked like. "Sorry I couldn't get something cooler, kiddo." "Oh, no, this is great," I replied, quickly realizing the relief in my voice could be easily mistaken for insincerity. Maybe it was better that way, maybe it was better that he didn't know a normal present was all I'd ever really wanted. "Well," he said, "might as well show you the ropes." He proceeded to show me how to work the telescope, how to adjust the focus, and when that was done enough stars had come out for him to show me how to find a few famous constellations. I was having so much fun, I barely noticed how late it gotten. Chris paused in his explanations to let out a yawn, and it was only then I realized just how tired he looked. The bags under his distant eyes were much deeper than they were the last time I'd seen him. Perhaps this so-called project at NASA really had taken its toll on him. When my mom came out to check on us, Chris told us he'd better go to bed now. I asked Mom if I could stay out for a bit longer and work the telescope on my own, and she agreed, as long as I came in if it got too cold. I think she was just happy I had the opportunity to play with something normal for once. As the night wore on, I continued to gaze into the eyepiece, observing the clear night sky in detail I'd never experienced before. I could see the star-dusted arms of the Milky Way, individual craters on the moon, and even convinced myself I'd found Jupiter and was looking at its own moons. Eventually even my parents went to bed, leaving me out in the cold, silent darkness with only the stars to keep me company. I paused to look up from the eyepiece, my left eye slightly sore from being squinted shut. I turned around to look at the dark silhouette of my house behind me, but in the process my foot caught on an especially slippery patch of ground, bringing me down with it. I winced, hoping I hadn't sprained it for my mom's sake. I crawled back to where I was pretty sure the telescope was, gripping onto one of the legs to pull myself up. As I was doing so, I paused. On the underside of the device, there was a dial I hadn't seen yet. Chris had claimed to have shown me every function of the telescope, but apparently he'd left one part out. Straining my eyes in the darkness, I could make out the notch the dial was currently set to, labeled simply 1. I looked back at the house again, wondering for a split second whether I should wake Chris up and ask him about it, but my curiosity overpowered any doubts I had. After all, it was just a normal telescope, right? I grabbed the dial and turned it slowly to the left until I heard a small click. Now it was set to another notch, labeled 2. I pulled myself the rest of the way up onto my feet, eagerly looking back into the eyepiece to see what had changed. And when I did, I couldn't stop a cold gasp of wonder from escaping my lips. The telescope had been pointing at the moon, which now looked so close it was as if I could touch it. I could see individual pebbles lining the floors of each crater, and I was sure if I looked hard enough, I'd be able to count the stars on the American flag. Then I found Jupiter again, and laughed in delight when I was able to see the great red spot clearly in all its swirling glory, with the occasional dot of a moon passing in front of it. The level of detail I was getting now was sheer amazement, not even comparable to what I'd been seeing before. I wondered why Chris hadn't mentioned this dial, the dial which seemed to unlock the Hubble telescope's true potential. Then, I realized that maybe this wasn't a Hubble telescope after all. Maybe it had something to do with Chris's latest project at NASA. Still, Chris had never been careful about giving me gifts, and had never obscured features of them from me. For him to suddenly be hiding secrets about something, it was out of character. In the end, I reassured myself that he'd probably just forgotten to tell me about the dial, and it wasn't anything I needed to worry about. I reached down to switch it back to its default setting, planning to find it again in the morning and ask Chris about it then. My hand faltered before it reached the dial. There was an additional notch I hadn't seen. It was labeled 3. I seriously debated what to do in that moment. It was getting absurdly late, and I was already chilled down to my bone. Who knows what new discovery I would make, and how much more of the night it would take up? But this time, I made absolutely sure there were no more notches left on the dial. This was definitely the last one, so I promised myself it would be the last thing I checked out before bed. I grabbed it and turned. It didn't budge. I looked closer at the tiny, printed number 3. There appeared to be a minuscule keyhole under the third notch, and it was my best guess that some sort of mechanism was preventing the dial from turning any further. Well, that was that. If I needed a key to get to the third notch, it clearly wasn't something I needed to be messing around with without Chris. I turned the dial back to 1, yawned, and walked back inside. The inside of our house was just as dark and silent as the outside now. My parents had retreated to their tiny bedroom upstairs, and I was about to do the same to my own bed in the loft, before I caught sight of Chris sleeping on the old couch in the living room. It was where he always used to sleep, back when he made regular house calls, and hearing his light snores then gave me an odd pang of nostalgia for the days when he would regularly visit us during festivities and hand me something probably illegal. Tonight was a bit different from those days, though. For one thing, Chris had his briefcase next to him, on the floor beside the couch. The mysterious briefcase I'd seen him handle many times, but that he always kept in his car. Perhaps in his exhaustion, he had forgotten to leave it there. If that was true, then, he'd also forgotten to close it. The white pseudo-glow of manila folders caught my eye in the dim room, confidential folders spilling out of the briefcase I'd always wondered about. I felt my feet taking steps towards it, knowing they shouldn't but being unable to resist the pull of what else might lie within. I was close enough now that if Chris woke up, there would be no excuse for me to be standing here. I squatted down, gazing into the darkness of that briefcase, wondering if I'd find answers to questions I didn't have. In the bottom, glinting in the weak moonlight streaming through the frosted windows, I spotted a tiny, chromatic key labeled with the number 3. "Okay, Eli," I said after a short mental skirmish with myself. "All you're gonna do is see if the key fits. Then you're gonna put it back where it came from and go to bed. No harm done, no questions asked." My heart fluttered as I pocketed the key, feeling as if I'd just stolen government secrets and the cops were gonna bust down the door any minute. But I'd already come this far, there was no stopping me now. Running stealthily back out the door, I hurried to the telescope to see if it would work. It did. There was one click and then another as I turned the dial from 1 to 2 and finally to 3. The third notch took a little more effort, as if it was sticky. Or as if it wasn't meant to be turned. I aimed the lens at a clear patch of sky with only a few distant stars in the way, just to give me a bit of legroom for what I'd be able to see through the eyepiece now. No amount of legroom could have prepared me for that. When I looked into the eyepiece, at first I couldn't quite make sense of what I was seeing. It was only abstract blobs to me. But as the focus adjusted, I realized I was no longer looking into the void of space. It looked like some sort of desert. A gray, sand-blasted desert with towering dunes and a brooding, amber sky crackling with distant lightning. And facing each other on one of the dunes were two things. I don't exactly have a word for what the texture of their exteriors looked like. That's probably because I'd never seen anything that did look like them. The closest I can think to describe them is rock-like, with cracks and crevices in their skin, but somehow still flexible. Their bodies were tall and tapered, wider at the bottom and separating at the top into two long appendages that amusingly resembled bunny ears. Or at least, it would have been amusing if it hadn't scared me out of my skin. The two beings were hovering slightly above the surface of the harsh desert, and if I didn't know any better, I'd say they were conversing with one another. I didn't see any facial features, but they seemed to be moving slightly in turns, as if to exchange words. Then, abruptly, they stopped. The one closer to me began to turn around, and as it did I was slowly introduced to two burning holes in its surface. Two white-hot eyes that, despite lacking any accompanying features, instantly let me know they were furious. Furious to have been spied on by someone like me. But wait, that didn't make any sense. How could this thing, this impossibly far away thing, know that I was looking at it? The distance between us must have been unfathomable then, and yet, did it see me? Without any warning, the closer thing, the one that had seen me, began to move. Fast. Toward me. The charcoal sand of the desert below was whipped up into a frenzy as it whirled closer and closer until all that took up my field of vision was the gray of its skin. I yelped, wrenching myself away from the eyepiece and falling backwards onto my butt. My head swiveled around rapidly, as if to search for an incoming threat. But there was none. The snowy yard was just as empty, just as silent as it had been all night. I was still here, and whatever I had seen was still all the way out there. Cautiously, I took another look into the eyepiece. It was still all just gray. I turned the dial back to setting 2, and the calming, familiar view of outer space was returned to me. As my heart rate slowed back to normal, I decided the cold must have been getting to me, and getting some sleep now would be my best option. I was sure Uncle Chris would have a good explanation in the morning, and that would be that. As much as I reassured myself, I wasn't able to get anything more than a restless sleep that night. The next morning I was awoken to the sound of an unfamiliar voice shouting. After a few seconds I realized it was Chris. I'd pretty much never heard him raise his voice before, so even in my groggy state I could tell something was seriously wrong. I made my way downstairs to find Chris and my parents standing in the living room, appearing to be engaged in a one-sided argument. Chris was pacing around, rambling about missing something, and my parents, both of whom were already late to work, stood there anxiously checking the clock. It was only after my mother managed to get a word in that he calmed down somewhat. All right, I understand you're upset, but could you just describe what it is we're looking for here, so we can actually help you? I've already told you 1,000 times, it's a tiny silver key and it was in my case last night and now it isn't. Got that? I felt my heart sink. Shit. I never put it back. There was no point in hiding it from him. I came clean, right then and there. I told Chris I took the key, and what I'd used it for last night. I wasn't expecting to get off completely for stealing it, but I at least expected him to calm down now that he knew where it was. Quite the opposite happened. His already pale face was drained of what little blood it had left. You two can go to work, he barked toward my parents, an unusually assertive comment from him. They were already late, though, and were likely glad to be free of his shenanigans. Once they were out the door, he turned to face me with his frenzied eyes. Show me exactly where you put it. I lead Chris outside to where the telescope still stood in the snow, a fresh dusting lightly covering its shiny black surface. I pointed to the tiny key, still in the slot where I had placed it to unlock the third notch. Chris urgently bent down, turning the dial from 1 to 3 again, and looking into the eyepiece. After a moment, he looked back at me, his eyes finally here and not somewhere else, and said only one thing. You need to leave. And that's the story of how my family got set up in a new luxury modern home on a secluded rural property. Chris never explained why he bought a new home for us, nor why it was so far away from our old one, but of course my parents were ecstatic about it. They were a little sad to leave our old friends of the rundown neighborhood in the past, but that was a small price to pay for a better life. I never told my parents what happened that night either. I didn't want them to worry about me. Chris still sent us the occasional check, but now that we were so well off thanks to him, we didn't need much of his help anymore. Eventually, he stopped sending us anything, stopped coming to our house, stopped communicating with us altogether. We forgot about him, and I forgot about what I'd seen in the telescope. My parents were able to get decent jobs, and after a few years, I moved out and got my own place. Everything was well. Until this morning. I was balancing the budget for my new house while the local news for my town was playing on the flat screen in the same room. It was just background noise, really. I wasn't paying much attention to what was actually going on. Not until I happened to look up at the right moment, to catch sight of something that made me do a double take. An extremely grainy photograph was displayed on the screen, the kind that could only be of something very far away. Outer space levels of far away. This was reaffirmed by the black background and fuzzy white dots scattering the background of the photo, but what stuck out to me was the dark, grayish blur in the center of the photograph. It shouldn't have meant anything to me, and yet, it did. Because this particular blur had a long, tapered shape. And it ended in what resembled like long bunny ears. Suddenly, everything that happened that night came back to me, and now I desperately needed to know the context of this image, fumbling for the remote and cranking up the volume. In other news, astronomers recently spotted this piece of debris as it rapidly entered our solar system yesterday morning. While its unusual shape may pique the interest of some, we are told that it is no cause of alarm, as dozens of meteors and other small space debris swing by planet Earth every single year. The recent meteor shower last weekend should be proof of this, of course. Oh, were you able to catch that, Sam? I had to work that night. I did indeed, Katie, and it was as beautiful as they say. I'll send you a video sometime. Now, here's the weather dash. The sounds of the TV meant nothing to me as they were replaced by the pounding of dread in my ears. I wanted to call Chris, to call someone who would understand, but I realized I haven't had his number in years. I don't know who else I can talk to about this, but I do know one thing. That debris isn't going to simply swing by planet Earth. Well, thanks.